Hello and welcome to the April RIV call on Improving Lives Part 2, Long-Term Complications and Psychosocial Health. Today's presenters are Jonathan Rosen, PhD, Associate Director of Research, and Jeanette Soderberg, PhD, Director of European Research.
It's really great to be here and tell you about the exciting work we're doing in the Improving Lives program. Our viewers may know that Jaderev has several scientific program areas dedicated to developing cures and treatments for type 1 diabetes. On the last RIV, I introduced the Improving Lives program and talked about the work we're doing to develop drugs and devices for better glucose and metabolic control. Today, we're going to go deeper into the Improving Lives program and talk about our ongoing work to address long-term complications and mental health issues in people with type 1 diabetes, as well as the training of the next generation of researchers and doctors. First, an overview for the Improving Lives program. Our vision is a world where people with type 1 diabetes live healthy and burden-free lives, and we're getting there by accelerating the development of drugs, devices, behavioral health interventions, and combinations of these to improve health outcomes and quality of life. Despite all the innovation we're seeing in the field, there are still major unmet needs for people with diabetes. For example, glucose control is still a major challenge, and broader metabolic control, by which I mean non-glucose factors like obesity or insulin resistance that contribute to health outcomes, is largely unaddressed by current therapies. Additionally, long-term complications, which we're going to focus on today, remain a reality for many with type 1. Additionally, people with type 1 diabetes are disproportionately affected by mental health issues, and these mental health issues in turn affect traditional T1D outcomes like A1C. For everyone with type 1 diabetes, T1D imposes a major burden of day-to-day self-management that takes a toll, and we're doing what we can to relieve that. We've come a long way in the Improving Lives program with developing therapies for people with type 1, but we have much further to go. And we're not going to stop until we have the drugs, devices, treatments, and behavioral health interventions that people with type 1 diabetes need. This slide shows all the steps you have to go through from discovery research all the way up to people with type 1 diabetes having better outcomes for a new product. I'm not going to go through each step of this development pathway, except to make the point that Jaderev has the in-house expertise and know-how and the commitment to move our products through each step of this pathway, and we'll ultimately judge ourselves based on how well people with type 1 diabetes are doing at the end of the day. As I said, in the last presentation, I focused on devices and drugs for glucose and metabolic control. And today we're going to be talking about drugs for long-term complications and psychosocial interventions. First, let's take stock of where we are and then where we want to go. Today, we have FDA-approved drugs for diabetic retinopathy or eye disease, which is great. But for reasons I'll explain later, we need more and even better ones. We have no targeted therapy for kidney diseases, and we're also lacking validated psychosocial interventions that can be used to improve mental health outcomes. In the future, what we're building toward is a world where there are therapies that can prevent, delay, or reverse diabetic retinopathy and diabetic nephropathy, which are eye and kidney disease, respectively, as well as having diabetes-focused behavioral health interventions to improve the mental health of people with T1D. I'm going to start by telling you about our work in long-term complications before handing it over to my colleague Jeanette Soderberg to tell you about our work in psychosocial. So Jaderev's long-term complications work is focused on disease of the eye and the kidney. Eye disease or diabetic retinopathy can ultimately lead to vision loss, and that's why it's so important for people with type 1. In one study, after 25 years, more than 90% of people with T1D had some stage of diabetic retinopathy. Now, I want to be clear, this doesn't mean that many people had vision loss or were at imminent risk for vision loss. Rather, this means that many people had some indication that there was a challenge to their eyes and that if left unaddressed had the potential to advance in disease later on. As I said, we have approved therapies for diabetic retinopathy, but they have limitations such as side effects, effectiveness, and accessibility, and I'll discuss that more later. Nephropathy is a long-term complication that affects the kidneys of people with type 1 diabetes, and it's estimated that more than half of people with type 1 will be affected. Right now, there are no approved therapies specifically targeting T1D kidney pathology. People with type 1 benefit from drugs that have generally positive effects on the kidney, like ACE inhibitors and ARBs. But to get really superior outcomes, we need a new generation of drugs targeted to the T1D kidney. The good news is that T1D complications have gone down over time, thanks in large part to improvements in glucose control, but we have much further to go. The best advice we have for people with type 1 on how to avoid complications in the future today is to reduce risk factors like controlling blood glucose as well as possible. In the future, we'll have more and better drugs for diabetic retinopathy and diabetic nephropathy as well. This slide shows our strategy in retinopathy and nephropathy, and what you can see is that all roads lead to new therapies. That is our goal, to get therapies to market for people with type 1 diabetes. And we're accomplishing this in several ways. One is to do clinical studies to understand T1D diabetic nephropathy better. Another major effort is to include people with type 1 diabetes in clinical trials testing drugs in nephropathy, either trials dedicated to type 1 or inclusion of people type 1 in type 2 diabetic nephropathy and retinopathy trials. It's simply the case that if people with type 1 aren't included in these trials, they won't be able to benefit from the drugs later on. And that's why this is such a critical goal. We also support preclinical development of new therapies. And a lot of work that we've done in the past has produced resources that the whole field is benefiting from. For example, genetic studies we've done in the past and biomarker studies that have developed factors that in the future will be able to be used to accelerate clinical trials. Lastly, a major part of our strategy is the use of significantly leveraged partnerships. Leverage means that we partner with someone who also contributes their resources to the project we're working on, which allows Jaderev to work with them and accomplish much more than we'd be able to on our own. And I'm going to take a couple of slides to show you why these leveraged partnerships are so important. This diagram shows what the progression of diabetic nephropathy looks like. I don't want you to focus on the details inside it, but just the line at the bottom which says years, and appreciate the time scale of nephropathy development, that it can take decades to develop. I'm not showing a graph for retinopathy, but you would see the same thing. Both of these diseases have very long natural histories. This makes drug development really difficult because, amongst other reasons, clinical trials have to be long to detect outcomes in a slow-moving disease. This is one of the big reasons why our partnerships are so important. It's an extremely difficult path to get these drugs forward, and we need all hands on deck and the best partners in the world who we've managed to find. This slide shows many of our partners in this space. It includes academic centers, governments, companies, and other nonprofits. I'll just call out a couple of them. One is the University of Michigan, which Jeanette Soderberg will talk about later in the presentation. And another is the NIH, who we have a very important partnership with on many different projects. Our goals in nephropathy and retinopathy are lofty, and we're relying on all of these partnerships we've built to help us achieve them. Now I'm going to take us through several different retinopathy and nephropathy projects so you can get more of a sense of sort of the exciting things we're doing, starting with retinopathy. The first initiative I'm going to talk about is our moonshot initiatives. And as the name implies, this is a big, bold effort we're taking to go where no one has gone before. We want to develop treatments for retinopathy that not only delay or prevent retinopathy, but can actually reverse it and restore vision loss that's already occurred. As a first step toward this goal, we're working on developing a new staging and severity scale for diabetic retinopathy. The scale that's currently used to assess retinopathy progression was developed decades ago, and we're working on updating it with new scientific information, which will be a better tool for clinical care as well as drug development. The Moonshot Initiative is being done by Jaderev in partnership with the Mary Tyler Moore and S. Robert Levine, MD Foundation, and we're really excited to be leading the way in this. Now I'm going to tell you about a couple clinical trials we're involved in. The first is to test a class of drugs called VEGF inhibitors. VEGF inhibitors, like Lucentis and Eylea, are approved for diabetic retinopathy and type 1 diabetes, thanks largely to early and then later Jaderev-funded research on these drugs. The way VEGF inhibitors are used today is to treat eyes that already have some degree of diabetic retinopathy. But we want to know if they're used earlier, can they actually prevent disease advancement? And of course, the reason we want to do this is that it's always better to prevent a disease than to treat it. If this trial is successful and shows that earlier treatment with VEGF inhibitors can prevent diabetic retinopathy in the earlier stages, that could change the way we care for people with this disease. Another trial we're working on, which we're really excited about, is testing a drug called phenofibrate. So VEGF inhibitors, the class of drugs I was just talking about, have been transformative for many people with type 1 diabetes, but they're not without their limitations. They're less than 100% effective, they're costly, and they're invasive to use. Phenofibrate, on the other hand, is a lipid-lowering medication, which is generic, orally available, which means it's very convenient to use. We know that it's safe, and it's cheap. And so a drug like this, if it can improve diabetic retinopathy, has the potential to transform clinical care globally. Existing data from other clinical trials done in people with type 2 diabetes showed efficacy for phenofibrate in diabetic retinopathy outcomes. And now Jaderev is supporting a definitive clinical trial testing the same drug in diabetic retinopathy in people with type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Again, if this trial is successful, it could change clinical care for people with type 1 in the US and everywhere else. This trial is being done with our partners at the DRCR, NIH, Roche, and the Helmsley Charitable Trust, several of the extraordinary partnerships that I've been talking about. Now I'm going to move from retinopathy into nephropathy, which again is kidney disease in type 1. So a major undertaking for us is to understand the pathophysiology of type 1 diabetes, diabetic nephropathy. One way we do this is by doing clinical studies, and a particular focus of our clinical studies is to obtain kidney biopsies from people with type 1 diabetes. And Achilles' heel in the field has been finding out exactly what's happening in the kidney. Because unless you really know what's happening in the organ you're trying to target, you can't develop the best possible drugs. Two consortia that we're involved in, which are obtaining type 1 diabetes kidneys and using them to discover new therapeutic targets, are called Trident and KPMP. One of our highest goals for developing new treatments for diabetic nephropathy in type 1 is running clinical trials with people with T1D. We ran a very important clinical trial with our colleagues at NIH, which also used special diabetes program funding, which we helped lobby for, called PEARL. This was a trial that tested a generic drug called allopurinol for early stage nephropathy in people with type 1. The trial didn't meet its primary endpoint, but in a different way, it was a giant success because it was the first and to date only clinical trial that's been done exclusively in people with type 1 diabetes for diabetic nephropathy. So this was a major achievement and serves as a model for how JDRF, NIH, and others can work together to do more T1D trials in the field in the future. Specifically, there are 3 classes of drugs that we're really eager to test in people with type 1 for kidney outcomes because the drugs have been shown in non-T1D populations, either T2D or other forms of chronic kidney disease, to have really great benefits. And based on what we know about the science, we think those benefits will translate to people with type 1 as well. I'm showing a graph from a publication of one of these studies with a drug called dapagliflozin. And the study was done in people with type 2 diabetes and other forms of chronic kidney disease. I won't go through the details, but what I want you to take away from it is that this plot is showing death from any cause during the clinical trial. And you can see what a big gap there is between the placebo and the drug line, the dapagliflozin. This gap between those lines indicates the lives that were saved over the course of the trial due to this drug. And this is what we're building toward for type 1 diabetes as well. In addition to supporting clinical studies and clinical trials on existing drugs, we're also doing preclinical work to develop new drugs for the next generation of therapies. We're working with investigators developing antifibrotics and anti-inflammatories for the eye and kidney, and even immunological approaches to treat eye disease. Of course, we're going to do everything we can to advance successful preclinical projects toward clinical trials as quickly as possible. I focus so far on retinopathy and nephropathy, And the last complication I'm going to talk about briefly is cardiovascular disease, or CVD. CVD is the leading cause of mortality in adults with type 1 diabetes. It's closely associated with nephropathy, such that people with advanced kidney disease often have bad heart outcomes even before they end up with the worst kinds of kidney outcomes. Also, available evidence indicates that cardiovascular disease in type 1 may be significantly different from how it is in type 2. For all of these reasons, first and foremost, the unmet clinical need, Jaderev will opportunistically support research that can improve cardiovascular outcomes in people with type 1. I also want to make the point that the drugs I mentioned on the last slide, GLP-1 receptor agonists, SGLT inhibitors, and finerenone, have been shown to improve cardiovascular outcomes in non-type 1 populations. So these same drugs are things we want to test in people with type 1 for cardiovascular as well as kidney outcomes. This is the same slide I showed before, which is a product development pipeline. I hope that from the examples I gave, you can see how we're working to push new drugs that come in at various stages of this pipeline toward people with type 1 diabetes to improve outcomes. Now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jeanette Soderberg, to tell you about the exciting work we're doing with psychosocial interventions for people with type 1.
So thanks so much, John. It's great to be here today to talk about this exciting priority area for Jaderev. And diabetes, as you all know, can be very tough sometimes. Most people struggle. However, some people do incredibly well with diabetes. They thrive, but sometimes people do struggle. Diabetes have reported to be a risk factor for psychological issues in childhood, in adolescence, and in adulthood, especially for issues such as distress, depression, and anxiety. There has always been a link between depression, distress, anxiety, and poor glycemic outcomes. And therefore, the psychosocial well-being and supporting people with diabetes to help them achieve optimal both diabetes and psychological outcomes is a key priority for Jaderev. For adults, 25% of adults are likely to experience depression during their lifetime, and more than that will experience diabetes distress. And while there are psychological interventions available, a lot of them have limitations, such as a lack of validation in large populations, or unclear long-term effectiveness, or issues around accessibility and reimbursement of treatment. In children and adolescents, there are higher degrees of depression, disordered eating, anxiety, and even suicide rates than in peers without diabetes. For instance, the rate of eating disorders is twice as high in girls with diabetes. In one recent study, 14% of youth with diabetes reported mild depression, 8.6% reported moderate to severe, but it's not all doom and gloom because 10% seem to be unaffected by depression. And researchers will now try to understand whether there are protective factors that protect children from developing depression and mental health issues. The hope is that if we understand potential protective factors, we can do more to prevent mental health issues in the future. So with this great need for better psychological well-being, Jaderev has made it a top priority to increase research in this field and has created a psychological program with 3 strategic areas in focus. The first one is to standardize outcome measures. Currently, it's difficult to compare treatments and healthcare pathways due to the lack of standardized measures. We need these to get an overview of the status today and provide a healthcare benchmark to improve care. The second is to increase the number of interventions available. We need to develop new diabetes-specific, well-validated treatment options and give everyone with T1D an intervention to try. The third is to increase the number of trained psychology professionals. We need to ensure that there are trained professionals that can deliver the care, deliver the new interventions, and support the community. And I'll walk you through these 3 aims in more detail now. Research on outcomes provides policymakers with the tools to monitor and improve quality in healthcare. Measuring outcomes is key to knowing not only what quality of care we can achieve, but also how we can achieve it. Patient-related outcomes, or PROs, provide a measure of what outcomes are important and meaningful to patients. Measuring these can therefore help physicians evaluate how treatments are benefiting this particular patients and treat them in a meaningful way. This is what we call personalized medicine. In clinical trials, including patient-related outcome measures in the trial protocol ensures that the impact of a trial is comprehensively assessed, also from the patient's perspective. So part of our effort is to incorporate PROs in clinical trials for drugs and devices to measure how they affect people's mental health well-being. So measures are important, and Jaderev is supporting several initiatives that are developing outcome instruments, for instance, for hypoglycemia, measures around disease stigma and body shame. We're also funding the refinement and enhancement of a standard set of measures for adults to be implemented in clinical care, and the development of a standard set of measures for children who are not small adults and therefore need their own measures. And of course, standardization and benchmarking needs to be done not alone, but in a global consensus and with buy-in from all stakeholders, which is why we're working with international organizations such as the WHO, OECD, and ICHOM, as well as large consortia, including the pharmaceutical industry, to develop these outcome measures. In order to achieve personalized medicine, precise medicine, which is the right treatment for the right person at the right time, we need to take a holistic approach to T1D and its complications. Some people develop complications early, some late, some not at all, and the same applies to psychosocial. And instead of treating everyone the same way, precision medicine is aiming at a treatment that is adapted to one individual and less of a one-size-fits-all type of care. At the Center of Excellence at the Elizabeth Weiser Caswell Diabetes Center at the University of Michigan, the team is working precisely on this holistic approach. They are currently integrating data from imaging, omics, genetics, CGM data, kidney, eye, metabolic data, all sorts of data you can find, as well as data on healthcare utilization and drug prescription. Then using artificial intelligence and analyzing this to create specific type 1 profiles. These profiles have different risk factors for different complications and probably respond differently to different treatments. So by identifying these patterns, the center is working on, in the future, identifying personalized treatments for both complications and especially for psychosocial issues. All of this research is very much cutting edge and very, very exciting. I just talked about personalized medicine, and of course, this is a narrowly focused on the individual with diabetes, but we also need to focus on the family, since ideally, young people's self-management of type 1 is a collaboration between the parents and family members and the person. Beyond the challenges of daily care and monitoring, children and their parents can face emotional and psychological difficulties that reflect on their own coping as well as their social circle and family situation. We know that higher levels of parental distress is associated with worse outcome for the children. And as many as 34% of parents experience levels of distress and report feeling isolated or feeling a sense of guilt or grief. And it's often something that drives entire families to have more conflicts. To help address this, many of our chapters have support groups and outreach programs to support families. And Jaderev is funding research to develop evidence-based interventions to help families in a larger way. And I must say that Jaderev has had the insight of doing that well before COVID, but we currently know that with the pandemic, the family support is even more important in these troubled times. We currently have a study ongoing, which is testing the efficacy of a telehealth intervention to improve family well-being. And we hope to see the results from this trial in the coming year. We just discussed how families and youth with type 1 can experience challenges in their daily lives. But additional social risk factors such as poverty, food and housing insecurities, mental health concern, or lack of a social support network can negatively impact self-management and also increase the risk of complications in the long and short term. The families of these youth are under a great deal of stress and are struggling with multiple challenges that prevent them from focusing on their child's health care. To address this, researchers have established, with the support of the Helmsley Charitable Trust, a model and methodology called niche, by which clinical sites are able to set up specific centers for underprivileged populations to increase their access to treatment and that way improve their outcomes. By increasing access to care, the niche programs show benefits, both outcomes and cost benefits. For instance, there is a significant lowering of A1C and the number of DKAs for these people. And moving forward to improve the care and the outcomes for these youth, Jaderev is supporting important research to understand the relative weight of risk factors when considering screening methods, as well as developing interventions for youth with type 1. So we want to understand which risk factors have the most impact and which should we address first in order to get the best outcomes for underserved and underprivileged populations. Good access to care is associated with better glycemic control and outcomes, not only in underserved populations, but also for everyone. And telehealth can enable people who would have otherwise had limited access to care to manage their type 1 mental health. It can be a very useful and efficient way to access care for people who are in remote rural areas, but also for those in the cities who might lack access to transportation and depend on family members to take them to the doctor, or lack of access to childcare, etc. It can also help address the stigma that some people experience when seeking psychological services for the first time and improve retention and keep people going to the therapist. And of course, again, with COVID, the telehealth has become a very popular form of therapy, but we actually saw the need and had an interest in this way before the pandemic. So we are currently supporting the development and deployment of a virtual care platform to improve mental health for adults with type 1 in rural areas. And because of the lockdowns that we have experienced in this year, we are convinced that this is the way to go forward. And we see an even greater benefit with the telepsychological approach than we had expected. So in addition to access to care, we also need more integration of behavioral therapies into routine care in order to effectively promote meaningful change in the psychological well-being of people and their families. To help increase the number of trained psychology professionals in diabetes, Jaderev has established a postdoctoral fellowship program to train new promising researchers and clinicians. The fellows divide their time between research and clinical work under the supervision of excellent, well-renowned mentors already in this behavioral type 1 field. And this is a fairly new program starting in 2018. And this year we have currently 4 enrolled fellows who are with us. Their focus areas have been very wide, covering post-traumatic stress, sleep, eating disorders, family interactions. And this has been intentional to, in the long term, strengthen all these areas when the fellows establish themselves and become experts in their field. So with all these new talents, the future is looking positive for the psychology field in type 1. This was a quick summary of the efforts we have ongoing, but I hope it was helpful to you to understand the exciting work that we do in the psychosocial field. So as a summary, improving lives of people with type 1 remains a top priority for Jaderev. We are the world leaders in this effort. The Improving Lives program is developing drug devices as well as behavioral health interventions to improve diabetes outcomes and the quality of life of people with type 1 at all stages of the disease and at all stages of their lives. We strategically drive the field forwards and ensure that our partners also invest in this space to be even more accelerated and powerful. And hopefully we'll hear more from John and me later this year with new exciting progress in this area of both psychosocial and complication. It has been absolutely fantastic to get the opportunity to speak with you, and we are looking forward to your questions. Thank you.